It seems that at any given moment, the world is on the brink of an all-out war. Unfortunately, there are now weapons that don't just end wars, but could end the entire world. This hasn't stopped multiple countries from saying, hey, we can make this horrible disease a whole lot worse by experimenting with biological warfare. Currently, there are a handful of deadly bioweapons that we know could end the entire world. These scenarios are extremely unlikely to happen, but in a worst-case scenario, bioweapons could be our downfall. During World War II, Allied forces built several factories to mass-produce anthrax. This bioweapon was never used in the war itself, but the bacterial agent still exists and could be weaponized if it fell into the wrong hands. When the anthrax bacteria comes into contact with the body, it can cause blisters and sores to break out in the skin. This can eventually lead to fever and respiratory problems as it enters the bloodstream. If left untreated, anthrax will enter the spinal fluid and the brain, causing meningitis. This causes the brain to swell and oftentimes leads to death. Someone who's infected with anthrax is not contagious, but if a mad scientist wanted to wipe out humanity, this might be one weapon that could do it. By somehow injecting anthrax into food, water sources, or the air, a large part of the human population could be infected. Anthrax would not need to wipe out every human on the planet in order to end the world. If the bacteria was released in high population areas, the large amount of deaths could throw humanity into chaos, and society would quickly break down. However, anthrax is not the scariest biological weapon that has been created by the military. In the 1950s, a bacterial pathogen was discovered as the cause of a pneumonia-type disease that was plaguing Australian slaughterhouses. The disease was infecting the animals and killing them in huge numbers. The United States Army Medical Unit saw an opportunity to learn more about the dangerous pathogen and started to infect volunteer soldiers with the disease. Once they understood what was causing the illness, the U.S. military decided it should be weaponized. Q fever was cooked up in a lab, and more than 5,000 gallons of the bacteria was grown. What made Q fever so enticing to the military was the length of time it could survive once deployed. The bacteria could thrive for up to 60 days and it was easily transmitted. These factors, on top of only needing a small number of bacteria to infect someone and make them extremely sick, made Q fever the perfect biological weapon. However, after the United States signed an agreement with the UN Biological Weapons Convention in 1972, the Q fever stash was destroyed, and the world sighed a breath of relief. That being said, there's no way to know if all the Q fever bioweapons were actually destroyed. The bacteria itself causes respiratory problems and pneumonia in humans. This means that if it were to get out, it would spread around the world like wildfire. And if Q fever was being used as a bioweapon, whoever controlled it could infect multiple regions of the world simultaneously, ensuring practically everyone would come into contact with the bacteria. The death toll could be high enough to end the world. In 2014, the medical branch of the United States military and the CDC developed a way to protect primates, including humans, from the Marburg hemorrhagic fever virus. This was in response to intel that uncovered the Soviet Union had weaponized the virus in an aerosol form. The scary thing about the Marburg virus is that it's in the same family as Ebola. The spread of Ebola can be slowed or stopped due to the way it's transmitted, and Ebola is spread through contact with infected blood or bodily fluids. By taking precautions such as wearing gloves and other protective gear, the virus can be contained. However, the Marburg virus that the Soviet Union weaponized could be contracted just by breathing it in. What made the bioweapon even more terrifying was that the Soviet scientists reported the mortality rate of the virus was around 90%. This means that if the Marburg hemorrhagic fever ever got out of the lab and into the world, it could be devastating. Once it started to infect people, the virus would spread rapidly, killing almost everyone in its path. Like all viruses, each time it infected a new person, the Marburg virus would have a chance to mutate. This could make it even more deadly. If this biological weapon were to become resistant to the drug that the US government made to stop it, the world would certainly come to an end. There are most likely other biological agents that have been developed in the military labs that we don't know about. So the weapon that could end the world might be sitting in a freezer somewhere just waiting to be unleashed. One thing is for sure, the next weapon we're about to talk about could end the world several times over. Nuclear bombs are probably the most destructive weapons ever created. However, a distinction needs to be made between the two different types. There are two classes of nuclear weapons. The two classes of nuclear weapons are atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs. Both are deadly, but one is capable of much more destruction than the other. The atomic bomb is the only nuclear weapon that has ever been used in actual warfare. This was the type of bomb dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima at the end of World War II. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed from the nuclear blasts in Japan and the fallout that followed. The explosion of atomic bombs is created by fission, or the splitting apart of nuclei of heavy elements such as plutonium and uranium. When this happens, an enormous amount of energy is released. Around 2 pounds of uranium-235 can discharge the equivalent amount of energy as 17,000 tons of TNT. The explosion is huge, and the amount of thermal energy generated heats the surrounding area to several million degrees. With the separation of the nuclei also comes a shockwave that can wipe out entire buildings located several miles away from the initial blast. Needless to say, the atomic bomb is definitely a weapon that could end the world. If a war breaks out where the atomic bombs are fired across the globe, everyone who is not wiped out by the initial blasts will eventually succumb to radiation poisoning or the nuclear winter that'll follow. However, atomic bombs are not the most powerful nuclear weapons that humans have created. The hydrogen bomb can be 1,000 times more powerful than an atomic bomb. And since the inception of the hydrogen bomb and the realization of their massive power, these are the types of nukes that militaries have stockpiled. The main difference between the hydrogen bomb and the atomic bomb is the way the energy is created. In a hydrogen bomb, the explosion happens due to an enormous amount of energy released by a process of fusion. Instead of splitting nuclei like in an atomic bomb, in a hydrogen bomb, two nuclei are fused together. Hydrogen bombs still use uranium and plutonium, but also have deuterium and tritium added to the mix to create the fusion reaction. H-bombs have never been used in an actual war, but they have been detonated to measure their power. These bombs yield enough destructive power to instantly end the world if they're all detonated at the same time. The largest explosion ever recorded by a hydrogen bomb was over Novaya Zemlya Island in Russia. It was called the RDS-220 hydrogen bomb, or the Tsar Bomba. On October 30th, 1961, the 50-megaton nuke was detonated with the equivalent of 50 million tons of TNT. This is approximately the same as exploding 3,800 of the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima. It should come as no surprise that relatively few nuclear weapons are needed to end the whole world. But one delivery system in particular was a major concern for the longevity of the human species. During the Cold War, the United States developed a miniature nuclear warhead and a launcher that could fire it. The crazy part was it could be carried, deployed, and launched by a single soldier. The weapon was called the M28 or M29 Davy Crockett weapon system. It looked like an oversized rifle with a small bomb attached to the end of it. The weapon was wildly inaccurate and very dangerous, which resulted in it being scrapped as the Cold War came to an end. All it would have taken is one rogue soldier making a bad decision to launch a nuke at the enemy. The counterattack would end up wiping humanity off the face of the planet. The Davy Crockett could launch its payload approximately 2.5 miles, which was barely far enough to ensure the soldier who fired the weapon was safe from the nuclear fallout. He most likely would survive the initial explosion, but could receive a lethal dose of radiation if he didn't get away quick enough. There was also not a kill switch, so once the weapon was fired, there was no going back. But perhaps the craziest part was that the United States made around 2,100 M28 and M29 Davy Crockett weapon systems, and those weapons actually were deployed with NATO forces in the 60s. This meant there was the possibility for individual soldiers to launch over 2,000 nukes from the field simultaneously. This weapon might have been the #1 potential catalyst for nuclear war at the time. Thankfully, all Davy Crockett weapon systems were destroyed or disassembled, as far as we know. Another weapon of mass destruction that could end the world wouldn't do so in a huge explosion, but silently. Dirty bombs are the name given to devices that release massive amounts of radiation without the detonation of a nuclear warhead. This is done with a highly concentrated mix of radioactive chemicals, which is then disseminated using regular explosives. The type of radiation that results from dirty bombs is gamma rays, which would rip through the cells of human bodies and cause damage at the molecular level. This can lead to symptoms like radiation burns and also cause mutations in DNA leading to cancer. A series of dirty bombs would most likely not cause the world to end right away, but given time, the amount of radiation that could spread across the planet would be lethal to the human species. The creepy thing about humanity being wiped out by dirty bombs would be the lack of the destruction. Buildings would be unharmed and entire cities would seem untouched. Years after such a world-ending event, it would seem like humanity was just blinked out of existence. That being said, all living things would be negatively affected, leading to a mass collapse in every ecosystem around the world. We're now moving away from nuclear weapons and into the world of world-ending substances. Like biological warfare, chemical warfare has been banned. But that doesn't stop insane dictators and military leaders from using it. The most terrifying thing about chemical weapons is that with enough resources and planning, they can be simultaneously released across the world. In the former Soviet Union, the military created a family of chemicals called Novichok. This weapon is a nerve agent, which means the chemicals block a nerve signal sent from the brain to the rest of the body. The interference of these signals eventually results in vital bodily processes shutting down and causing the person who has ingested the chemical to die. Signs of exposure to Novichok are dilated pupils, problems breathing, and uncontrollable convulsions. After this occurs, there is only death. And if the nerve agent was somehow disseminated across the entire world in food or water supplies, it would quickly wipe out a huge number of people. An even scarier thought is if the Novichok could be mass-produced and then airdropped like pesticides from a crop duster across the world. a number of casualties would be even greater. Another chemical agent that could have the potential to end the world would be sarin. This chemical weapon was invented in 1938 by Nazi scientists, and it's also considered a nerve agent as it attacks the body in a similar way to Novichok. When sarin enters the body, it begins to block nerve signals in the enzyme receptors, which then causes the body to convulse and spasm. After some time, the person dies of asphyxiation or heart failure. What makes this chemical weapon even worse than Novichok is that it has the ability to persist in the air for hours or even days after being deployed, depending on the weather conditions. The gas itself is invisible and odorless, which means that if it's used in large scale, it will take time to figure out what's killing so many people. Also, if a vast quantity of sarin gas was continuously deployed in one area, wind and air currents could move it across a region, putting countless lives at risk. The creation and stockpiling of sarin was supposed to be banned in 1997. Yet as recently as 2013, it was used in Damascus, Syria on rebel forces. It's estimated the death toll was as high as 1,300 people, including civilians and children. Clearly, this lethal chemical weapon still exists, and if deployed across the planet, could wipe out much of humanity. One weapon that has the ability to end the world is something that practically everyone can get their hands on. In order to end the world, all someone really needs is a bullet, a rifle, and an important target. Take World War I, for instance. The assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip plunged Europe into war. The bullet that killed JFK almost caused the Cold War to turn hot. These instances of gun-causing mass turmoil could be what ends life as we know it. Imagine what would happen in today's world if the leader of a country like North Korea or China was assassinated. Depending on the circumstances, a single bullet could lead countries with powerful militaries to do crazy things. Taking it a step further, if the assassination of practically any world leader was carried out by a foreign government, it could lead to a global war. Unfortunately for everyone involved, an all-out war today would look very different than it did in the past. The major players would probably end up being the NATO nations versus countries controlled by dictators under the guise of communism. Both sides would continue fighting a war started by a rifle with weapons of mass destruction. Perhaps the end of the world will be caused by weapons not yet built. One such weapon could be the rods from God. Basically, the rods from God would be missiles, bombs, or other destructive devices dropped from satellites in space. The impact velocity would be enormous as gravity would pull the weapon down to Earth from orbit. Such weapons could be something as simple as a solid tube made of heavy metal that could rip through a structure causing it to collapse, or a conventional nuclear bomb. Regardless of what is being dropped from space, the decision would be devastating. This is especially true if multiple rods from God were deployed all at once. There are currently somewhere around 7,500 active satellites in low Earth orbit. Imagine if each one of these satellites were equipped with this technology. It's not out of the realm of possibility that in the near future, warfare will be fought both in and from space. As space is militarized, the number of satellites will only increase. If that's the case, they will also most likely be equipped with a defense and attack system. The weapons that end the world might not come from Earth itself, but from high above it. Weapons such as lasers have been the dream of military leaders for decades. But with the rapid advancement of technology, these death rays may be closer to reality than ever before. In the past decade, the military has been tinkering with ways to mount lasers onto planes to help shoot down missiles. This laser technology is still in its infancy, but it's progressing quickly. Right now, the lasers are mostly being deployed to destroy missiles, bombs, and drones. However, in the future, these high-energy lasers could be used for much more destructive missions. If lasers become large and powerful enough, they could be mounted on planes from where they could shoot down at targets on Earth below. In the future, warfare using bullets and missiles might be a thing of the past. High-powered lasers could continuously rip through military installations and whole battalions of soldiers. They could also be used to destroy buildings and cut down entire cities. And if a laser was powerful enough, it could destroy a planet, just like the Death Star from Star Wars. We are still a ways from that type of laser technology, but it was only about 15 years ago when the first iPhone came out. Now we have high-powered computers in the palm of our hands with internet access pretty much everywhere in the world. Think about what else will be accomplished in the next 15 years. The weapons of the future will likely look very different than the weapons of today, and death by laser might be the way the world ends. Then again, maybe it's the weapons of the past that could lead to the extinction of the human species. In the 1950s, the CIA conducted a series of experiments under what came to be known as MKUltra. This was a covert program to see whether mind control was possible. The theory was that by using psychotropic drugs, the brain could be altered and programmed. The military forced subjects to take LSD, barbiturates, and amphetamines and then monitor their behavior. It's not entirely clear what the outcomes of the MKUltra tests were, as CIA Director Richard Helms had all the records of the project destroyed in 1973. However, with advances in neuroscience and our understanding of how the brain works, maybe the world will end with a brainwashed spy assassinating a world leader. Or maybe a team of sleeper agents will infiltrate the highest levels of a country's military and detonate their nuclear stockpile all at once. These are all obviously far-fetched situations that would likely never happen, but it's hard to know just how far MKUltra and mind control went since all the files were destroyed. Some of the most bizarre military weapons ever created were the result of equipping animals with technological upgrades. During World War II, the United States military toyed around with the idea of equipping incendiary explosives onto bats and dropping them onto enemy territory. This came to be known as Project X-Ray. The thought was that by releasing thousands of fireball bats onto Japanese cities, they could ignite homes, buildings, and other structures, causing everything to burn to the ground. This wasn't the only experiment with weaponized animals. DARPA had also conducted research around implanting microchips in different animals like cockroaches and rats to allow humans to control them. The animals would likely be used for reconnaissance missions or to collect intel in heavily guarded facilities. However, with the way technology is advancing, maybe it's not too long before we start equipping these animals with explosives that can cause massive damage and casualties. Imagine a war not fought by humans but by cyborg animals that are fitted with bombs, lasers, or even biological weapons. The end of the world might not happen from conventional weapons, but from military experiments on animals gone wrong. Humanity could be wiped out by the very creatures we once manipulated for our own selfish purposes. Then again, maybe this is a sci-fi fantasy, and we'll just blow ourselves up the old-fashioned way using nukes. Only time will tell.